Paris is a city built on layers of history, memory, and the dead. Beneath its streets, beneath its walls, and underneath its landmarks are the remains of people and stories long since buried. But in some cases, buried doesn't mean gone, because every so often, something resurfaces. A voice, a story that refuses to stay where it was left. So what is it that keeps the dead from resting? Is it unfinished business? A need to be remembered? Or something else entirely? Today we're exploring a collection of Parisian legends that all ask the same question, but in different ways. Why don't the dead stay buried? Welcome to the Book of Lore. Long before Gaston Leroux wrote The Phantom of the Opera, and long before the masked figure of Eric became part of literary history, there were already whispers in Paris about a man who lived where no one was meant to survive. One of the figures sometimes linked to the origin of that myth is a man named Ernest, a pianist said to have been disfigured in a fire at the old Opera de la Rue Le Peltier, the opera house that stood before the Palais Garnier. In some retellings, Ernest's life didn't end when the fire was over. Instead, it unraveled. Shunned because of his injuries and grieving the loss of the woman tied to that same tragedy, he is said to have withdrawn from the world entirely. And as the new opera house began construction across Paris, the story goes that he found his way into its unfinished underground spaces, slipping into the half-built corridors beneath the stage before the building was ever complete. From there, the legend becomes uncertain. Some versions claim he survived below ground for years, living in the maze of tunnels and the hidden lake beneath the opera house. Others suggest he became little more than a rumor amongst workers, a presence felt more than seen, a figure that seemed to belong to the building itself rather than the world above it. What matters is not whether Ernest definitively lived beneath the Palais Garnier. What matters is that people believe someone could. And that idea of a man buried beneath a building, not in death, but in disappearance, became one of the quiet foundations for Gaston Leroux's later creation of Eric, the Phantom. Because once the Opera House opens in 1875, the stories don't stop. They multiply. A stagehand found hanged backstage, a chandelier counterweight snapping loose during a performance in 1896, killing a spectator in the audience. Reports of voices in empty corridors, a soprano who swore she heard someone calling her name from nowhere at all. Each incident on its own has a rational explanation, but together they begin to feel like something else, as if the building never fully finished settling, as if something beneath it never stopped pushing back against being forgotten. Even sightings and whispers attributed to the Phantom blur the line between mystery and memory. No body is ever confirmed, no proof ever survives investigation, and yet the story persists anyway, passed from one generation of performers to the next, which raises a different kind of question. If something is buried, but people keep hearing it, is it really gone? Or is it just waiting for the right moment to be heard again? Because beneath the Palais Garnier, nothing was ever fully removed. It was only contained. And sometimes, containment is just another way of saying it's still there. In the legend of the Palais Garnier, it was grief that seemed to linger, a spirit unable to let go, a presence tied to heartbreak, obsession, and a life that ended long before it was supposed to. But not every haunting stays behind because of love. Some remain for an entirely different reason. Because long before the Phantom was said to wander beneath the Opera House, another figure was already haunting the history of Paris. Not hidden in darkness beneath the stage, but appearing in the shadows of kings, emperors, and bloodshed. A figure many believed arrived before disaster itself. They called him the Red Man of the Tuileries. The origins of the Red Man stretch back to 16th century France, following the death of King Henry II. With the king gone, power increasingly fell into the hands of his widow, Catherine de' Medici. And with that power came rumors, whispers that Catherine relied heavily on astrologers, occult advisors, and assassins. One name surfaced more than the others: Jean Linger, also known as Jean the Skinner, or in some tellings, Jean the Flayer. According to legend, Jean carried out secret murders on behalf of the crown. Political enemies, rivals, anyone considered dangerous to Catherine's rule. But eventually, Jean learned too much. And people who know too much rarely survive long around rulers desperate to hold on to power. Fearing exposure, Catherine allegedly ordered a soldier named Neville to murder Jean inside the gardens of the Tuileries Palace. The killing itself was said to be brutal, quick, silent, another body disappearing into the long, blood-stained history of the French court. But according to the legend, the story didn't end there. Whenever Leto returned to dispose of the corpse, the body was gone. No blood, no remains, nothing. And rumors soon spread that before his death, Jean had sworn he would return, not for revenge, for warning. Shortly afterward, Catherine reportedly visited an astrologer seeking answers, and it was there, according to the story, that the prophecy had emerged. A figure dressed entirely in red would forever haunt the palace grounds. Appearing before disaster, before bloodshed, before death, and eventually, the prophecy turned toward Catherine herself. The astrologer warned that she would die near Saint Germain. The warning disturbed her so deeply that she abandoned the Tuileries Palace entirely, refusing to ever live there again. But fate, according to the legend, has a cruel sense of humor. Years later, while lying on her deathbed, Catherine requested a priest to perform her final rites. The friar who entered the room introduced himself as Laurent de Saint-Germain, and in that moment, the omen was fulfilled. From that point forward, the legend of the Red Man only grew. Every time tragedy approached the French monarchy, sightings reportedly followed. Servants claimed to see a figure moving silently through the halls late at night, never speaking, never approaching, only watching from the edges of candlelight, always dressed in crimson, always watching. And over time, the descriptions became even more disturbing. Some described the Red Man as small and twisted, almost devil-like, a hooked nose, a hunched back, one burning eye, cloven feet. Others believed he wasn't a ghost at all, but some kind of demonic omen tied directly to catastrophe itself. And according to the stories, looking into that single eye was unbearable. Not because it was monstrous, but because people claimed it felt like the figure already knew something terrible was about to happen. The Red Man soon became linked to some of the darkest moments in French history. It was said he appeared before the assassination of Henry IV in 1610, before the execution of Louis XVI, before the fall of Marie Antoinette. One of the most famous sightings supposedly came just before the insurrection of August 10th, 1792. And according to written accounts, Marie Antoinette's ladies-in-waiting were gathered inside the Palais des Gardes within the Tuileries Palace, when suddenly they realized they were no longer alone. Standing silently nearby was a small figure dressed entirely in scarlet. And according to the account, they rushed to the apartments of Madame la Dauphine and related their adventure. Not long afterward, revolution consumed France. The monarchy collapsed, and thousands died beneath the guillotine. But strangely enough, one of the most powerful men in French history was said to welcome the Red Man's appearance: Napoleon Bonaparte. And according to legend, Napoleon deeply believed in the Red Man. Some stories even claim the figure advised him before major military campaigns. The first alleged encounter supposedly took place in Egypt before the Battle of the Pyramids. At first, Napoleon's rise seemed unstoppable. victory after victory pushed him closer toward becoming one of the most feared military leaders in Europe. But the Red Man's warnings eventually changed. Before Napoleon's Russian campaign, the figure reportedly appeared again, this time not to encourage conquest, but to warn him. The Red Man allegedly told Napoleon that if he continued forward, his victories would end. But Napoleon ignored the warning, and history unfolded exactly as the legend claimed it would. Despite commanding one of the largest armies Europe had ever seen, the French forces collapsed during the Russian campaign. The retreat became catastrophic. Supply lines failed, winter consumed thousands of soldiers, and by the time Napoleon's army escaped Russia, only a fraction had remained. Another warning, another disaster, another appearance of the Red Man tied to the downfall of powerful men. And then, in 1871, came the final sighting. During the suppression of the Paris Commune, revolution once again erupted across France. As fighting spread through Paris, the Tuileries Palace was deliberately set ablaze. Men flooded the halls with tar, petroleum, and turpentine before igniting the structure. The fire consumed the palace completely, one of the most iconic royal buildings in France, reduced to ruins. And according to the legend, the Red Man was seen shortly before the flames overtook the palace, watching and waiting, as though witnessing the final collapse of the place he had haunted for centuries. The Tuileries Palace never recovered. Its ruins were eventually demolished, and after the fire of 1871, sightings of the Red Man seemingly disappeared. Some believed the spirit had finally perished in the flames, but others believed something far more unsettling, that the Red Man was never tied to the palace itself, only to disaster. But somewhere, he's still waiting for history to bleed again. The Red Man's curse was simple. No matter how powerful someone became, disaster eventually found them. Kings, queens, emperors, none of them escaped what was coming. And maybe that's what makes the next story so unsettling. Because while the Red Man warned people that death was approaching, Countess Demidov tried to bargain with death itself. Buried beneath one of the most famous cemeteries in France lies a tomb surrounded by whispers, obsession, and a promise so strange that people still speak about it centuries later. A promise claiming that anyone willing to spend a full year beside her coffin would inherit unimaginable wealth, assuming, of course, they survived the experience first. Buried deep within Père Lachaise Cemetery, among towering mausoleums and crumbling stone monuments, sits one of Paris's strangest legends. A tomb surrounded not just by death, but by temptation. The mausoleum belongs to Countess Elizabeth Demidov, and according to legend, she left behind an offer so disturbing that people traveled from across the world trying to claim it. An offer that promised unimaginable wealth, but at the cost very few could endure. The story begins in the 19th division of Père Lachaise Cemetery, one of the oldest, most visited burial grounds in the world, a place already overflowing with grief, memory, and superstition. And hidden among its winding paths and elaborate crypts stands the mausoleum of Elizabeth Alexandrovna Stroganov-Demidov, a Russian aristocrat born into extraordinary wealth. Her family fortunes were tied to salt, fur, and eventually iron through her marriage to Count Nikolai Demidov. By all accounts, Elizabeth lived surrounded by privilege. Among towering mausoleums and crumbling stone monuments sits one of Paris's strangest legends, a tomb surrounded not just by death, but by temptation. The mausoleum belongs to Countess Elizabeth Demidov, and according to legend, she left behind an offer so disturbing that people traveled from across the world trying to claim it. An offer that promised unimaginable wealth, but at the cost very few could endure. The story begins in the 19th division of Père Lachaise Cemetery, one of the oldest and most visited burial grounds in the world. A place already overflowing with grief, memory, and superstition. And hidden among its winding paths and elaborate crypts stands the mausoleum of Elizabeth Alexandrovna Stroganov-Demidov, a Russian aristocrat born into extraordinary wealth. Her family fortunes were tied to salt, fur, and eventually iron through her marriage to Count Nikolai Demidov. But by all accounts, Elizabeth lived surrounded by privilege, luxury, status. But according to the legend, death became the one thing she feared more than anything else. After her death in 1818, her family reportedly discovered something bizarre hidden within her will, a challenge. Elizabeth supposedly promised 1 million francs to anyone willing to spend an entire year inside her mausoleum. 365 days, 366 nights, alone. But the conditions made the challenge far stranger. The participant had to remain near the Countess's coffin at all times. They could not leave the tomb. They could not speak to anyone. Food would be delivered once daily, but no conversation was allowed. And according to some versions of the story, the watcher would spend every moment surrounded by mirrors lining the walls and ceilings of the crypt. Mirrors reflecting the Countess from every possible angle, because at the center of the mausoleum sat a glass coffin, and inside it was Elizabeth herself, still visible, still watching, with some accounts claiming her body appeared almost untouched by decay, as though time itself had somehow slowed inside the tomb. Whether that part of the story was ever true is impossible to know, but honestly, it hardly matters, because the image alone is disturbing enough. Imagine spending an entire year trapped beside a corpse. No conversation, no distraction, only silence. And your own reflection endlessly staring back at you from every wall. According to newspaper articles and later retellings, numerous people attempted the challenge. Very few lasted more than a few days. Some allegedly fled the mausoleum screaming. Others reportedly suffered complete psychological collapse. One account described a man emerging from the crypt as little more than a jabbering idiot. Another claimed a participant died shortly after leaving the tomb entirely. Even members of Elizabeth's own family supposedly failed the challenge. No one could endure the isolation. And over time, the story only grew stranger. Rumors spread that the Countess herself was not entirely dead, that the mausoleum had been designed not as a resting place, but as a feeding chamber. Some believed Elizabeth was a vampire, an entity slowly draining the life from anyone foolish enough to remain beside her coffin too long. And strangely enough, the architecture of the tomb only fueled those suspicions. The mausoleum itself feels unusually theatrical, with massive stone pillars, ancient symbols, an elevated sarcophagus. Some visitors pointed towards carvings of bats and wolves decorating the structure. Others focused on the repeating figure eights hidden throughout the design, symbols some occult traditions associate with infinity, resurrection, or eternal life. The tomb itself sits along the Valley of the Assayas, a tree long associated with immortality and rebirth. And according to certain interpretations of vampire lore, Elizabeth's body was even positioned facing the setting sun, every detail slowly becoming folded into the legend. And then, decades later, the story evolved again. In 1917, German author Karl-Heinz Strobel published a fictional story inspired heavily by the legends surrounding Countess Demidov. In his version, a man agrees to spend a year inside the mausoleum of a wealthy woman, only to slowly become convinced she is returning each night to feed on his blood. And from that point forward, the Countess Demidov legend became permanently entangled with vampiric mythology. But beneath the supernatural speculation, there may be a much simpler explanation for why the challenge existed at all. Fear. Specifically, the fear of being buried alive. During the 18th and 19th centuries, the terror consumed much of Europe. Medical science still poorly understood coma-like states and certain illnesses. People worried constantly about being declared dead too early, only to awaken sealed inside a coffin underground. Some coffins were built with bells attached to strings. Others included flags, breathing tubes, and even loaded pistols, anything that might allow the buried person to signal for help. And suddenly, Elizabeth's bizarre request begins to feel less supernatural, because maybe the challenge wasn't about the greed or immortality. Maybe she simply wanted someone nearby, someone who could hear her if she ever woke up. And honestly, that possibility may be more disturbing than the vampire legend itself. Because while monsters belong to folklore, being trapped alive beneath the earth is terrifyingly human. And somewhere beneath the streets of Paris, surrounded by silence, mirrors, and centuries of decay, Countess Demidov's tomb still waits, silent, sealed, and according to the legend, still offering its possible bargain to anyone willing to enter alone. But maybe the most unsettling part of Countess Demidov's legend isn't the idea of vampires or curses. It's the fear underneath all of it. The fear of death, the fear of being forgotten, and the desperate hope that somehow something of us might remain behind. Because throughout Paris, there are places built entirely around that idea. Places where grief settled so deeply into the city, it never fully left. And few places embody that feeling more than the Chapel Expiatoire. A monument not built to celebrate victory, but to mourn what France lost when revolution turned to bloodshed. The French Revolution changed France forever, not just politically, but spiritually. Before the revolution, Paris was overflowing with overcrowded cemeteries and unsanitary burial grounds, places where the dead were packed tightly beneath the streets of the living. But as revolution consumed the city, death itself became impossible to ignore, especially in Paris. From the early days of the uprising, images of death spread everywhere. And in 1789, prints showing skeletons allegedly discovered in the cells beneath the Bastille circulated throughout the city. Rusting chains, human remains, forgotten prisoners. Whether the stories were fully true hardly mattered. The imagery alone captured the mood overtaking France. Because the longer the revolution continued, the more death became part of everyday life. Executions turned public. Crowds gathered to watch the guillotine fall. And eventually, Paris itself began struggling to contain the bodies. One place in particular became deeply tied to that bloodshed: the Madeleine Cemetery. Originally established in 1722, the cemetery already held hundreds of dead long before the revolution reached its peak. Among those buried there were over 100 people killed during a catastrophic fireworks incident in 1770 while celebrating the marriage of King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, an event many later viewed as a grim omen for the doomed royal couple. But during the revolution, the cemetery transformed into something far darker. After the storming of the Tuileries Palace in August of 1792, bodies began arriving faster than they could be buried. Victims of riots, executions, political violence, and soon the cemetery became one of 4 primary burial grounds used for victims of the guillotine during one of the bloodiest periods in French history, the Reign of Terror. Between 1793 and 1794, hundreds of people were executed in what is now known as the Place de la Concorde, only a short distance from the cemetery itself. The condemned included aristocrats, political enemies, even former revolutionaries who had once supported the terror before becoming consumed by it themselves. And among those brought to the Madeleine Cemetery after their executions were King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, both buried quietly in unmarked graves. No cemetery, no royal honors, just more bodies disappearing into the growing earth beneath Paris. But they weren't alone. According to historical records, more than 500 victims of the revolution were discovered to have been buried there in mass graves. Names once feared across France now reduced to anonymous remains beneath the soil: Madame du Barry, Olympe de Gouges, and according to some accounts, even Maximilien Robespierre himself was temporarily interred nearby before his remains were later transferred elsewhere. The revolution had begun by devouring kings. Eventually, it devoured its own architects too. By 1797, the cemetery itself ceased operations. Years later, many of the remains connected to the revolution were transferred into the Paris catacombs, the underground network of tunnels and ossuaries holding the bones of more than 6 million people beneath the city streets. But the story of the Madeleine Cemetery wasn't finished. In 1814, after the fall of Napoleon, King Louis XVIII ordered the remains of his brother, King Louis XVI, and his sister-in-law, Marie Antoinette, exhumed from the cemetery and transferred to the Basilica of Saint-Denis. And 2 years later, construction began on a new monument built directly over the old burial grounds, the Chapel Expiatoire. Built in 1816, the chapel was intended as both a memorial and an act of atonement, a structure dedicated to mourning the royal family and acknowledging the horrors of the Revolution. But beneath the quiet elegance of the chapel, the dead still remained. And over time, the building itself became wrapped in an atmosphere many visitors described as deeply unsettling, cold, oppressive, heavy with silence. Some people claimed the underground chambers felt wrong the moment they entered them. Others described sudden nausea, cold spots, an overwhelming sensation of being watched. And honestly, whether anything supernatural exists there or not, the feeling itself is understandable, because beneath the chapel lies layer upon layer of trauma, public executions, mass graves, centuries of grief compressed beneath the stone. And then, in 2018, something happened that brought those buried memories violently back to the surface. Americ Pernigay de Stutes, the chapel's administrator, noticed something unusual while inspecting the lower chapel. The columns appeared uneven, almost hollow, as though empty spaces existed within the walls themselves. Curious, investigators inserted a small camera through openings in the stone, and what they discovered shocked them. Hidden inside the chapel walls were 4 large ossuaries, containers filled with human bones, fragments of skeletons still sealed within the structure itself. According to reports, forensic specialists identified human phalange bones among the remains. I cried when the forensic pathologist assured me he had seen human phalange bones in the photographs the chapel administrator later admitted. And suddenly, the Chapel Expiatoire became something more than a memorial. It became a tomb, a hidden necropolis quietly holding the remains of revolution victims inside its walls for cemeteries. A monument built not only to remember the dead, but literally constructed around them. And maybe that's what makes the chapel so unsettling. Not ghosts, not curses, but the realization that Paris is filled with places like this. Places where history never fully disappears, where grief settled into the stone itself, and where the dead, even centuries later, still remain beneath your feet. And maybe that's the strangest thing about Paris. Beneath the beauty, the music, the monuments, and the lights, the city carries ghosts. Not always literal ones, but memories, tragedy, fear. Stories that refuse to disappear no matter how much time passes. A phantom said to wander beneath an opera house, a crimson figure appearing before bloodshed, a tomb promising wealth in exchange for isolation beside the dead, and a chapel built over the remains of a revolution that consumed an entire nation. Different legends, different centuries, but all connected by the same uncomfortable idea. That some events leave scars so deep, places never fully recover from them. And maybe that's why stories like these survive. Not because people truly believe every detail, but because cities remember things, even when people try to move on. And perhaps nowhere embodies that feeling more than Paris. A city where beneath the romance and elegance, history still lingers quietly in the shadows, waiting, watching, remembering. And maybe today, after hearing these stories, you'll find yourself wondering how many people walk past places like these every day without ever realizing what happened there before them. So remember, some stories don't fade, they follow. Until next week, thanks for listening. New episodes of the Book of Lore release every Tuesday. Please rate, follow, and review. It greatly helps the show. Have any other lovers of lore in your life? Share with your friends, family, and loved ones to help the show become a place for lovers of the spooky, mythical, and creepy to come together. You can follow the show on Instagram, TikTok, and Threads at Book of Lore Pod. Have a great week, and thanks for listening.